Hi, it's Brad from Ocean Consulting Services, and in today's video we'll be discussing tax collections in Massachusetts. What should I know? So let's run through the highlights. Dealing with state tax debts is a different process from dealing with the federal government. Many times clients will ask, well, I dealt with the feds, won't the states just accept what I did with the federal government? And the answer is absolutely not. There is a completely separate program for each state. It's important to recognize that if you're dealing with a federal tax debt, most likely you're dealing with a state tax debt as well. There are separate programs available for the states. Specifically in Massachusetts, they do offer programs similar to the federal, the primary programs being installment sales and offers in compromise. So a couple general observations. It may be surprising to many listening to this video, but the IRS is generally easier to deal with than the state governments. They tend to be more flexible, and they also tend to have well-defined rules and regulations in dealing with debt collections, which you don't always find in the states. Now, in most situations, the state tax debt is less than the federal debt. So a typical situation we run across is where a client may want to enter into an offer in compromise negotiation with the IRS, and it may make more sense to just deal with the state, pay them in full, or enter an installment agreement rather than try to get an offer in compromise from the state. Depending on a particular situation, that's a fairly frequent scenario we run across, is we work with our clients to get on a payment plan for the state and then deal with the IRS through their offer in compromise program. Now, let me talk a little bit about tax return filing considerations. Typically, when you file your federal and state taxes, you're using software, you're preparing and filing the returns at the same point in time. However, I would caution that if you know you have debts to the federal and state governments, and you anticipate asking for an offer in compromise for the federal government, it may be advantageous to file a state return, let them assess, get into a payment plan before filing the federal return. And the reason being that when you calculate your reasonable collection potential, the RCP that we've discussed in previous videos, in the RCP computation, if you file both returns at the same time, the IRS will apportion your available cash income between your federal and state tax debts. However, if you let the state assess the tax prior to the IRS assessing, you will be allowed a full deduction for the state tax payment as opposed to having to apportion it. So you may be in a better situation. The advice is when you're filing both federal and state, step back for a second. If you're potentially requesting an offer in compromise from the federal government, you may want to file the state first, get on a payment plan, and then file the federal return. Once the federal government assesses, then you can do an offer in compromise, and because the state is ahead of the federal government in terms of legal priority, you'll be allowed a deduction for the entire state tax payment. Now let's get back to Massachusetts. They do offer an installment agreement similar to the federal program. However, as I mentioned, there are different requirements under the state programs than exist for the federal program. Specifically in Massachusetts, if you have a debt of $5,000 or less, your minimum monthly payment is $25. You get up to 36 months to pay off the entire debt. You can set up the payment agreement online, and you do not need to provide any financial statements. This is sort of equivalent to the automatic arrangement that the federal government offers. Relatively easy to set up and obtain. Now, for debts over $5,000, the monthly minimum is up to $50 a month, and you do need a financial statement, and you have to provide an explanation as to how you arrived at the monthly payment, and also attach supporting documents like bank statements, W-2s, etc. So it's a more involved process, but Massachusetts will allow for an installment agreement for debts over $5,000 as well as under. Now, as mentioned before, Mass does have an offer and compromise program similar to the IRS, but some differences. In terms of dealing with compliance, like the federal government, Mass requires that all your past tax returns have been filed and you're current with your estimated tax payment requirements. However, Mass does require full payment of the liability from your most recent tax return. This is unlike the federal government, which does not require that payment. In terms of reasonable collection potential, or RCP, Massachusetts does follow the federal guidelines. They use the federal allowances, etc. Minimum offer. In Massachusetts, it's $5,000. Federally, there is no minimum. You have to offer at least $1. In Massachusetts, there are limited circumstances where you can request a payment below $5,000, but additional justification is needed. In terms of payment for the offer and compromise, Mass does offer two alternatives similar to the federal, a lump sum and an installment payment option. For the lump sum, they require 20% payment upfront, similar to the feds. Mass requires the balance within 60 months. The federal gives you 5 months. For the installment payment arrangement, the rules are the same between the Fed and Massachusetts. Both require initial payments to begin upon submission of the offer, and the total payments are made within 24 months. So now on to our conclusion and what's up next. This video has been specific to Massachusetts. However, most states offer similar programs, primarily in the installment area and offer and compromise. The moral of this story is, in any tax debt situation, don't forget about the state tax debt and take into consideration you'll need to deal with both tax debts. Thanks for joining us. Up next, we'll discuss what's referred to as an SFR, which is a substitute for return. Please contact us if you have any questions or need any assistance. Thanks.